good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming along to this webinar. It's been hosted by EuroMaTech, who, as I'm sure you know, are one of the world's leading training providers. EuroMaTech's been around for 23 years now, and I'm pleased to say that I have been working with them for 20 of those years. I'm going to be your presenter today. I'm Paul Wright. EuroMaTech covers a wide range of training areas. We've worked around the world with a wide range of companies, from small startups to major multinationals in a range of different countries. I'm sure you know all about us. What we're going to be doing today is looking at some of the things in my area of speciality, which are procurement and supply chain. So we're going to be looking at a couple of elements that come from two courses we're going to be doing, from our Advanced Purchasing Management course and our new course on restarting your supply chain, which is particularly focused on the challenges that we're all experiencing in business now as a result of the global pandemic that's been going on, and that some industries are also suffering from as a result of low oil prices. I'll come back to who I am again in a second. Just want to give you a little bit of housekeeping. Your audio and visual and video are muted, so I can't see you and I can't hear you, and you're not going to be recorded or anything like that. If you have any questions, then please put them in the chat box, which hopefully you'll be able to see. And if we've got time at the end, I'll be more than happy to answer any and all questions people have got. I'm not in a rush to get off anywhere. The session is being recorded, and that will be available to everybody after we have finished, hopefully as soon as this afternoon. I'm going to say goodbye to you now and get on with actually doing the presentation, but I'll be happy to take your questions at the end, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Okay. Right. Hopefully you can still hear me. Let me go back a little bit, tell you something about who I am. My name is Paul Wright. My background was originally I trained as a scientist. I've been working in procurement and supply chain management for more than 25 years now, and I do a lot of work for my government here in the UK. That's possibly not something that is such a great idea at the moment, but my background is in the petrochemicals and oil and gas industry, working for a chemical company called ICI. The modules I'm going to be looking at today are two courses that are coming up. There's Advanced Procurement Management, and we're doing that as a 2-day session online, cut down from our 5-day normal course that we deliver face-to-face. We're looking at that 21st, 22nd of June. Obviously, we can't cover absolutely everything in 2 days, but we do hope we'll get to the core issues that are important for people. The new course we're doing on the 14th, 15th of June is about helping you restart your supply chain. And that's looking at the definitions and the problems that we have in supply chains, and beginning to challenge some of the things that we're actually taking for granted for the last few years. And then on the second day, we start looking at some of the solutions, some of the opportunities, and how we can actually restructure them in a way that's going to give us some long-lasting competitive advantage and make sure we deliver everything we need. I've brought elements of those two together to this webinar, which will take about 1 hour. From the Advanced Purchasing Management, we're going to look at the way we segment our requirements and then how we measure our performance. And that's interesting because we get very used in our normal activities to measuring things in a certain way. When we're in the middle of a crisis, such as we're in now, then we have to think about, are those measures appropriate? Do we need to measure some new things or measure things in a different way to make sure we get the best result overall? Then from the restarting your supply chains, I'm going to go and look at risk. And something I've already hinted about, supplier development. Do we need to develop new suppliers to spread our risks, to make sure that we've actually got more local, national providers, and that rather than just trying to make sure we get the best prices and the best quality, we try to make sure that our supply chains are resilient, that they can absorb a shock. So this should take, I say, in total about an hour. I'm going to start off with some of the segments from Advanced Purchasing Management. And what we're trying to do there is basically highlight the importance of procurement for the organization. Fundamentally, if your procurement isn't giving you what you need, it's very, very difficult to be successful. But it's not a standalone activity. It's something that we need to integrate across the organization and have teams of people working together to make sure we get the best value, because everybody can focus on their own job, do a good job in that, but the sum of the parts isn't actually optimized. So what we're trying to do is to demonstrate that we can work together to get best value across the whole organization. Why is that important to think about now? Well, as I'm sure we've all noticed, there have been some recent shocks. The coronavirus has disrupted our supply chains. People have found that rather than just getting the best price or the best quality, availability can be a major problem. There may be delays, there may be shortages, the quality of things may not be what we wish them to have, and that depends on the supply chain functioning properly to get us everything we want. We've got used to it, and maybe it's time for us to just think about it again, make sure we make the right decisions. Combined with that, if you're in the oil and gas industries, we've got another problem. The price of oil, and this is Brent crude from here in the North Sea in England, the oil price has crashed. From being relatively steady at about $60 a barrel, it went down to about $20 a barrel. That causes us a major problem. In our normal way of doing things, that would put a lot of emphasis on cost reduction. But we've got two things going on here. We've got a low oil price and we've got a global pandemic. We need to think properly about what we're doing to make sure we get the best. If we focus on one, it's going to cause us problems in the other area. We all know what we have to do to be successful. We need to have the right strategy. To do that, we need to have some information, and then we can develop our plans. And I want to start talking about strategy first of all, because in procurement, it's very easy to assume what we're there to do is to try and just get lower prices. Those who have been working it for a while will know that that's not the only thing we need to do. However, people don't always understand how we develop our strategies. And the tool I'm going to share with you now is one that was developed by a guy called Peter Kraljic, who worked for McKinsey. He came up with a very simple model that can help us to think about how we're going to go and develop our strategies. Most of us are used to the fact that we have signing limits, that if something is less than, say, $10,000, we can authorize it. If it's above $10,000, it has to go to our manager. If it's over $1 million, we have to go to the tender board. We're used to the way we segment things in terms of how much money we spend on them. What Peter Kraljic suggested is we should look not only at the amount of money we spend, but also about the risk, about the importance of these things to our organization. How dependent are we on them? By doing this, he came up with a simple 4-box model: low cost, low risk, high cost, high risk, low cost, high risk, and low risk, high spend. Now, to try and make this a little bit more relevant to people, I give some examples from our home. If we look at our personal life, there are things like bread, fruit, water where we have a lot of choice. We have a lot of different brands, we have a lot of different suppliers, and more or less they're all the same. And more or less they're all relatively cheap. We may have preferences, but they're pretty much commodity items, and it's not worth our time doing an awful lot of shopping around. We don't spend enough on bread to make it worthwhile going an extra 5 miles to get something a little bit cheaper. This is referred to as the acquisition box. If we run out of things in the acquisition box, it's usually not the end of the world. There may be something else we can do. If the price isn't ideal, it's probably not worth doing too much to try and get a better price. We may end up losing money by actually focusing on doing work to get a better price. When we're looking at something like a refrigerator, actually a bit more expensive, we've still got a lot of choice, a lot of different brands, all of them will do a good job. But it's now worthwhile doing a little bit of shopping around, a little bit of talking to the salesman, a little bit of talking to the store manager, see if we can get a discount. It's worth it because there's enough money involved. Some things we spend a lot of money on and they're very high risk. Your organization will spend a lot on training. You may have spent a lot of money on getting your education. If you go to the right college, the right university, that money will be well spent. You will have good skills and the training will be recognized and will be valuable to you in your career. You could choose to go to somebody with a lower price and a lower reputation. That's a trade-off you have to consider, because the difference in price may be very small and the difference in reputation, the value you get, may be huge. And obviously, as training providers ourselves, we would hope that you will see investing with EuroMaTech gives you the best benefit. You can also think about that with your investments. It's something you need to get right. So it's worthwhile doing research, it's worthwhile thinking about it, because those investments are what we want to keep us in the position in life we want to be going forward. If we invest in something that is going to lose us money, and I was looking at Aston Martin just the other day, which has lost 98% of its value in the last 2 years. Great cars, but a bad investment. We have to think about them because there's a lot of money involved. If we get it wrong, there could be negative consequences. The one that people who aren't in procurement find difficult sometimes to get their head around is what we call bottleneck. Things that are relatively cheap, but really important for the organization. And in home, the example I give there is medicine. It's very important for us, and we all know it has to work. What's important for us is making sure there is a chain of provenance, so we know it came from a reputable drug company, that we can be assured of the quality and the medicine will work. It's not about paying a little bit more or less. It's relatively cheap, and so the price is actually not the important thing. It's about making sure we have access to it, making sure it's available, and that we get the right quality. Now, we sort of do this in our personal lives. In work, we can do it in a very structured way. I've got the same illustration here, but without the little pictures, just to make it easier for you to see, just in case there was any problems on the reception. Let me think about it from a work point of view. Now, one of the things that happened in the pandemic is that something that we would normally see as a bottleneck item, personal protective equipment, has suddenly been raised up as a major issue. Things like gloves, masks, face masks, shields are relatively cheap. But because of the global pandemic, demand has gone up tremendously for them, and we suddenly realize how important they are. People's lives are protected by this equipment. If we cannot get it, then people's lives are at risk. It's not about price, it's about availability, making sure we actually have enough and it's in the right places. Organizations all need certain things like pens, pencils, notepads, hammers, screwdrivers, nails, screws, and those are the things that come into the acquisition. Doesn't really matter what brand it is. We do need to have them, If we run out, it's probably not the end of the world. Transport is very interesting because though there are specialist requirements, it is designed to be as interchangeable as possible. We're used to 40-foot containers that will fit on a standard tractor unit. And the whole aim is to make each transport provider interchangeable with each other one. And so in this case, what we can do is we can focus on the price because we know that all the providers are equivalent. One of the things that's been happening, though, is that as a result of the pandemic, there have been shortages of things like drivers. And that could mean that things we've got used to being driven by price have now become more important, they've become higher risk. We need to check that and think about it. Top right-hand box, the strategic box, is where I put things like our IT systems. If you have SAP or Sage or Oracle, your business, your organization depends on that. Changing is not going to be easy. So you better have made the right decision of the right system for your organization, because it's very difficult to change and your whole organization depends on it. Now, as you can see, this is quite a simple model, but it helps us to think about things in different ways. What it can tell us is what our objectives should be. In the strategic area, there's a lot of money involved and a lot of risk. So yes, we want to ensure supply and minimize the risk. We have to manage it carefully. In the acquisition area, we don't need to be quite so bothered. If we have a temporary shortage, it's not going to be a problem. We want to do it as quickly and easily as possible. And one of the interesting things here in the UK has been how people, as a result of the pandemic, have been buying their groceries and other food online and having them delivered, which makes it easier. Maybe it's a bit more expensive, but we don't have to go to the supermarket. We can just set up a standing order and it will just come to us. Makes life easier. The bottleneck area is where we've had some of our problems. We need to ensure supply. It's not about the price. And that tells us something about what we might want to do, which means we may want to have stocks. One of the challenges has been the leverage area, where normally we want to maximize our profit and drive down the price from the suppliers. That works fine in steady state. We just need to wonder at the moment whether that is the right approach. Sort of actions we'll do in the leverage area, we want to have short contracts and we will change suppliers quite often to try and get better prices. And again, that's an action that we're used to, relatively short tender periods, playing the market to get the best deal at the moment. But there is a problem with that. If people haven't got no security, if we have no commitment to them, then we're going to be down the list of their priorities. Is that what we want at the moment in the current situation? Is it what we'll want next year? For the bottleneck area, buffer stocks suddenly become super important. But one question will be, do we have higher stocks in the future than we have at the moment? Or did we have the right amount of stocks and just the unusual situation caused us a problem? That's something we need to think about. We need to have contingency plans, and we need to maybe ensure that supply by having long contracts with key suppliers. The acquisition box, we just try and keep it simple. The strategic box, we want to work with suppliers, have a partnership. But one thing we always need to do is look not only at what we want, we need to look at what the suppliers want. And a standard model for looking at that is the supplier perception matrix. If we see them as strategic and they see us as a core customer, that should be great. A spirit of partnership is going to work fine. One of our problems might be if we see them as bottleneck or leverage, and they see us as an exploitable customer, somebody with low attractiveness, no future prospects, but there's an opportunity to make money, they're going to be far more interested in maximizing their profit now than building a future relationship. And that means at a time when we're trying to ensure supply and manage costs, we're going to be stuck because our suppliers are going to be trying to exploit us. We need to understand that and understand the changing dynamic of the situation around us. What does it suggest for us? Well, obviously we want to work with the strategic suppliers. We should have been doing that. The bottleneck suppliers are now perhaps recognized as being more important than we felt they were. We want to make sure that they see us as a core customer. If they have any decisions to make, we don't want them to decide to exploit us. We want them to see us as a key part of their success. Some of the acquisition suppliers may go bust. We are expecting that many small businesses will go out of business. If it's acquisition, it's low cost, low risk to us. That's not merely really a problem. There will be plenty of suppliers left. But the leverage one is one we have to keep an eye on. They are people we have been trying to drive prices down with. They may now have a lever to ramp up their prices to us. That's something we've got to be careful about. That moves on the next thing. What are we going to measure? Because what we measure tends to be the performance we get, and it's also how we are seen as being successful. Standard procurement key performance indicators, KPIs, tend to be like this. This is just an example I found. I'm not saying it's ideal, but it gives us some idea of the priorities. Number 1 is savings. Number 2, cost reductions. Number 3, cost avoidance. That's a fairly common set of priorities. And with the global pandemic, we have to go and ask about that. The reduction in the oil price makes those 3 issues more important perhaps than they were before. We need to reduce our costs to maintain our viability. But in the middle of a pandemic, looking for savings, looking for cost reductions, trying to avoid costs may be the wrong way around. We may cut costs and make ourselves a less attractive customer and suddenly find we don't have access to supply. And then our choices will be to pay very high prices or possibly to stop our operations because we run out of bottleneck type items, which are quite cheap but absolutely essential. What we take people through is the process. Got to go and look, what are our KPIs now? What do we think they'll be in 6 months' time when hopefully things are normalizing? And what are they going to be in the future? The process we try and take people through is to say, we should look at what our strategy is. What are we trying to do? I showed you some example KPIs, but every organization has to write up their own, create their own. What is important to our organization that helps us ensure our success? So we can work out a corporate strategy, and then we can identify an appropriate supply chain strategy. And we may actually have different strategies for different products. The acquisition area, we probably don't need to have a major strategy. Strategic partners, we will have a long-term plan. Leverage, we may have a strategy of changing quickly to make sure that we get the best prices. Bottleneck, maybe we develop long-term contractual relationships with key providers. Maybe we keep high stocks. All of these things are possible, but what we should do is work out what's most important to our organization. And one way to do that is to look at our critical success factors. What are the things that we have to do in order to be successful? If we can work those out, then we can develop key performance indicators that track how we're doing in those areas. The critical success factor is not just a buzzword. It's something, if it fails, then whatever it is we're doing, our project, our activity fails. It's essential for success. If we can fail in one area and it doesn't stop us being successful, it's not critical success factor. We can then develop key performance indicators based on them. Not all KPIs are linked to keys, CSFs, but most of them should be. And we need to beware the idea of measuring things just for the sake of measuring them if we don't know why we're measuring them and why it's important. Every KPI should have an owner, and they should be able to know what actions are taken if we are not meeting that requirement. So as a process, we identify the CSFs, critical success factors, work out what we need to improve, develop appropriate key performance indicators with the key stakeholders, and then monitor and review performance. Now, one of the common things here is that each organization has a different view of key performance indicators. That's why we say we need to work across the organization in multifunctional teams. If I was working in operations, I probably want to make sure that we have high stocks so that I never risk having to stop manufacturing or production because we run out of parts or components or even standard consumables like greases and oils. Is that the right approach or is it not? It's something we have to discuss. And what people have been used to over the last few years, when we had a lot of challenges in business, but it was a relatively steady state compared to where we are now, is we get used to measuring the things we measure. And at the moment, we need to go back and say, are we looking at the right things? And do we have the right targets, the right ambitions for those KPIs? One thing we also look at in the course here is an idea that came in from Norton and Kaplan that says we should have a balanced scorecard of KPIs. Most organizations have financial targets or budgets we're going to meet. Most of them have internal KPIs. What Kaplan and Norton argued is that we should also look at customer KPIs, and that could be internal customers. So we could see stores and warehousing as having operations as their customer. We could look at sales being a customer for operations. Or we can go outside of our organization and actually look at the actual customer or recipient of our services, recipient of what we're doing. We need to get some measures looking at their feedback on us as well. And one thing that people often underestimate, particularly when we've got something like a training crisis, a COVID crisis, a pandemic, and pressure on oil and gas prices, that's learning and development. If we don't give our team the appropriate skills, then they're going to underperform. No matter how willing they are, no matter how keen they are, they're not going to have the right skills. And I'm a football fan, and at the moment we see with the pandemic that in many places football teams are beginning to go back to training. Why do football teams do training? Surely they know how to play football. It's to make sure everybody is match fit. Everybody's got the right idea. They're practiced. They've got good habits. They haven't allowed bad habits to get into their activities, and that everybody knows how to work together as a team. Then you get the best result. And that's what learning and development KPIs are about, making sure that people don't get out of touch, out of match practice. And we're going to need that because we're going to need people to be at the top of their game in order to restart our supply chains. And that's what I want to look at in the next part of our webinar. And these are some materials that we have in our 2-day Restarting Your Supply Chain program, where basically we look at where we are today, and then on the second day we look at where we want to be after this is all over. One of the key issues that we talk about there is risk. And risk is a really interesting thing. I've already talked about supply risk, but that's only one of the risks. It's very easy for us to focus on prices, on costs, on efficiency. But one of the things that becomes clear in a time like this is that if you have a very efficient supply chain that's very lean, it will operate in the most efficient way possible, that will save money, but it will be brittle. It is potential that it will actually break and snap. And we then have to go and look at what we're going to do in that event. And risk is fine until something happens. And when something happens, there's a blame game. You should have thought about this. We should have thought about it. What should we do? But the pandemic is a great example for us. We could say we should think about the price of oil going up or the price of oil going down and what are the implications. But the pandemic was a bit of a shock to us all. We didn't expect it to be like this. And this is just an example of what's sometimes called a black swan, something we didn't see happening. A black swan is invisible at night, but it's still there. Some of you may remember the volcano in 2010, something that personally affected me. I was lucky enough to be on holiday in Sharm el Sheikh, and we were just getting ready to come back, and somebody said, "Have you heard about the volcano?" And I said, "What volcano?" And it was the volcano that put an ash cloud all over Northern Europe that meant there were no flights for about another week or 10 days. I'm not going to try and pronounce the name of it, but some of you may remember it. Now, this is also interesting for us because as EuroMaTech, we're a global training company and we run programs all the way around the world. And this could have affected us. And one of the things we're proud of as an organization is the fact that we didn't drop a single training course. We were able not only to use our trainers who are already on site in Dubai and other locations, but to bring in trainers from Southeast Asia, from Australia, from South Africa, who were not affected by this. And we could maintain our offer to you, our customers, as a result of it. Now, we can't say we had a plan of what to do when there was a volcano. It involved a lot of people working very hard to make it work, but not everybody was able to do that. And these things happen. They come out of a clear blue sky, and sometimes they can have very significant impact. Another example, minor one, is about mobile phones. Back in 2010, you might still have had a Nokia phone. Certainly 5 years before that, everybody had Nokias. And the question is why? One of the major issues was that both Nokia and Ericsson used computer chips that were made from the same factory in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They had a very small fire, contained within 5 minutes. But the problem with the fire is smoke, and the smoke damaged the facility that was closed for 3 months. Nokia had a contingency plan. They bought up stocks, they changed design, they used alternative providers. They were unaffected by this factory fire. Ericsson were totally dependent on this one factory, and they lost 3 months production, which meant they fell behind Nokia. Nokia moved ahead, never looked back. Ericsson ended up being sold to Sony and has now split out again. Never recovered. And it's all down to one small failure in one small part of our supply chain. Why did the people at Ericsson not realize they were so dependent on that? Good question. Maybe they'd not thought about it. Or maybe they thought the risk was insignificant. Maybe they were aware of the fact of the good quality and low prices they were getting from that factory. Maybe they never asked themselves what could go wrong. And that's something we can do in risk analysis. This is you may have heard of a thing called Murphy's Law. If a thing can go wrong, it will. And sometimes taking that very pessimistic or negative approach is what we need to do. We need in business sometimes to do a what if analysis. Now, a person who actually popularized this is Colonel John Paul Stapp, and that is him in the picture you can see here. He was a medical doctor who was in charge of the ejector seat program in the American Air Force. And he believed that he couldn't ask anybody else to be the guinea pig, to be the test person for these ejector seats. So he did it himself. And if you're the person who's going to be testing ejector seats, then you're going to make sure that you think about absolutely everything. As he says, if a thing cannot go wrong, it still will. And you've got to think sometimes, what is the worst that could happen? And how are we going to prevent it? How are we going to make sure we're ready for it? This brings us to risk analysis that we like to try and get people to do. There's 3 parts. There's the impact of the risk. Is it high? Is it medium? Is it low? Obviously, we can link that back again to our Kraljic positioning a little bit. If something's in the bottleneck area and we cannot get it, that would be a high impact. If it's an acquisition type product, then that's probably a low impact. Then we have to think about the probability of something happening. Now, I live in England, in the United Kingdom, and over here it rains. It rains a lot. So we adapt. We get used to it raining. We all have umbrellas. We all know what to do when it rains. What we find very uncomfortable is high temperatures. Last summer, temperatures in the UK got up to about 30, 31 degrees. And for us, that was unbearable. My colleagues over in Dubai were saying 31 degrees sounds lovely, perfect. I'll wear a light sweater. We thought it was impossibly hot. And that's because temperatures of 30 and 40 degrees are common in Dubai, so we adapt to it. Rain is common in the UK, so we adapt to that, but we don't adapt to having temperatures even in just the 30s. It just doesn't happen. And what we can think about here is the consequence of the risk. It's the product of the impact and the probability. Something may be very, very high impact, like the volcano, but I'd not heard of that happening before. The tsunami that we saw in Fukushima, I'd only heard of one before that, and that was the one in the Gulf of India. So terribly devastating, but very rare events. Is it worthwhile planning for them? It may be worthwhile having them in the back of our mind, but how much effort do we want to put into it? And this is a standard way of looking at it. Things that are high impact and highly likely, we have to do something about. Things that are low impact and low likelihood, we can afford to not think about. One of our problems is that sometimes because things are low likelihood and they haven't happened or they haven't happened in a long time, we don't think about them at all. And things that are low likelihood but high impact, we still need to have a contingency plan to know we should be doing. The reds, the high impact, high likelihood, we probably have a plan. The low impact, low likelihood greens, we can forget about. In the middle, we need to think about what we're going to do and how do we mitigate and manage the problem. I'll say people don't think about the core risks faced with our business all the time. We should be doing more than we do. And we should also be thinking about, are the risks in our business or are they in our suppliers? Because we may have total clarity about what's going on in our business, but we don't actually know what's happening in our supplier's business. And some of these risks are not going to change. One of the things that is likely to happen as a result of the coronavirus is it's going to be very difficult to get people to move from one place to another. And that may mean that people we are depending on are not able to come and deliver their services where we want them. I know of a new chemical plant that's been built in Germany. It was a turnkey project and the construction has been finished. But the commissioning team cannot travel to Germany to commission the plant. And so it is sitting there idle because if the commissioning team do not come, they cannot use it, because the warranty on the turnkey plant is dependent on the commissioning team from the manufacturer being the people who commission it. When will people be able to go to Germany to carry out their work? I don't know. But there is a real cost. We should look at the individuals who are delivering services for us and think what's going to happen. What if they were unfortunate enough to get ill? What if they can't get a visa? What if the companies we were doing business with are going to close? They're not going to start up again after the pandemic. Obviously, we are in a force majeure, irresistible action situation, something where businesses can legitimately say, we cannot fulfill our contracts. What's the next one going to be? We have had the pandemic. 10 years ago was the global financial crisis. These things do happen. What are we going to do when it does? We may have issues with health and safety. We may have a situation where people cannot move, people cannot gather together, and it may be impossible to do things on the basis of video calls. These are risks, weren't things we necessarily thought about. How do we manage them? Well, something we look at is, say, you have to develop your own individual plans, but there are 4 or maybe 5 general actions. We can tolerate them. We just accept the risk is there, there's nothing we can do about it. The most common way we do is to treat it, to manage and reduce the risk. So we see that with the coronavirus, with people wearing masks, with people doing social distancing, with people doing home working when they can, so that we can try and reduce the likelihood of the virus spreading. We can transfer the risk to another entity, for example, by getting insurance. This is not always possible. Can you get insurance at the moment against coronavirus? It would be very, very expensive because the risk is there and there's nothing people can do to mitigate it fully. So if you want insurance, it's going to cost you a lot of money. General principle is that risk should be borne by the party best able to control it. And we have to be clear about that. Is it us who are able to control it, or is it our suppliers? And a common thing people do is we pass the risk to the suppliers without really thinking, can they actually deal with this? And that's where our supply chain snaps, because they accept it because they want the contract, and then they cannot deliver. And we've had many cases as a result of the pandemic of people promising to deliver personal protective equipment and other things such as testing packs, which in the end they either couldn't source or didn't work because they weren't the quality we needed. And we feel comfortable having placed a contract with somebody, but normal rules don't apply. They may not be able to fulfill that contract, even though they thought they could. That may lead us to the 5th one, which is terminate. Shall we just stop the activity and cancel the contract? The 5th one is something I like to put in. It's not commonly part of the system, but we are commercial people, and sometimes we know the risks, but we also know the benefits, and we can make a commercial decision. We will take a risk knowing that it could go wrong, but accepting that risk because the benefits are worth it. These things need to be developed for everybody. And at the moment, we're in a situation where we're having to revisit these risks and wonder what they actually are. And that's what I want to think about in the last section of what I'm going to do today, is just look at where the risks are. And to remember that because of the situation we're in now, we have to think about them again. Now, one thing that has come up is that people have suddenly become aware again of the extent of our supply chains. Now, I have an iPhone, and you may have one too. And iPhones are great examples of our extended supply chains. It was designed in the USA, and if you look on the back of an iPhone, as hopefully you can see in the illustration, it says designed by Apple in California, assembled in China. Of course, we would say, that, being British, that the designer, Sir Johnny Ives, was British. And you probably bought it in the Middle East or Nigeria. So we've got globalization in one simple handheld device. Components from around the world end up in there, including raw materials from Africa, components from Taiwan or Japan and the United States. And the chip itself was designed here in the UK. Global issues. And we've got used to that. And we've got used to being very dependent on Chinese manufacturing. And people are wondering whether that's something we need to change. Well, it's something we can consider, but first we need to understand what is actually going on. Because a lot of people think that the reason we actually buy things from China is because wages are cheap in China. And in fact, that's not true. There is a cost element, but it might also be that we cannot get materials or components anywhere else than China. And one thing that's happened is a result of iPhones and Samsungs being assembled in China. They have quality processes that the rest of the world don't. They have the capacity, they have the factory size. They're people who are skilled in working in these industries now. They have clusters of expertise, of competence. Those are things that we need to think about as well. It's easy to say, let's go and get something made locally, but can we do it? It's not all about cost. What has happened is that the Chinese market has grown significantly over the last 20 years. 500 million people, 500 million people have moved out of poverty in China in the last 20 years. They now have a strong internal demand. That means that costs are rising within China. Production costs are rising within China. But because initially they had capacity and were cheap, we've concentrated a lot of supply there. The question is, have we concentrated all the risk there as well? This is just a comparison. And people find this surprising. But I've looked at China, Mexico, and Vietnam. And already 5 years ago, in 2016, China was much more expensive than Vietnam, twice as expensive. $5 in China, $2.50 in Vietnam. In 2020, prices of costs and wages in China have gone up even further. Now $6.50 an hour and only $3 in Vietnam. The reason I put Mexico in is because, of course, Mexico is right next to the United States, got a huge market, and it's actually cheaper than China. So we're not doing it just because China is cheap. What about other places? Well, I've got some examples here, and these numbers are all over the place because comparisons are very difficult to make. They're never quite exact. But if you look at this in the USA, it might be $28 an hour is an average salary in manufacturing. In my country, the UK, it's about $30 an hour. We're more expensive in the UK than we are in the USA. European Union has a vast range of countries and 500 million people, and it ranges from $6 an hour in places like Romania and Bulgaria to $47 an hour in Germany. So you can see within the European Union, there's a lot of choices about where manufacturing and assembly might be made. But what's relevant for the UAE is that based on a production supervisor of about 50,000 dirhams a year, works out about $2 an hour. Now, additionally, there are extra costs and taxes and all sorts of things to be included in that, which will be different in different places. But I hope you can see it's not just about the cost of manufacturing. Wages. There's a lot of other factors we need to consider. Just to make it a little bit clearer, I put these in a chart so you can see that the hourly wages in China are going up and continue to go up quite significantly, whereas in Vietnam, they're actually going up much more modestly. So if you're actually looking at a low cost manufacturing environment, you'd probably look at Vietnam rather than China. What we need to do is look at the risk in our supply chains as well as the cost. And because things have been stable for a while, we've got used to having very efficient but brittle, very cheap supply chains. Now maybe we need to start looking at whether we can make those supply chains resilient, robust. But we should understand that probably does mean that costs are going to go up. But there are situations where that would be the right approach. From what we said in the first part, that would be for bottleneck provisions. If we've got new products, new formulations, then again, maybe we want to make sure that we've got security of supply rather than the best possible price. If we're moving into a new location, that's fine. One thing I haven't actually mentioned so far is tariffs and export bans. And for the first time in a generation, there are now becoming more barriers to trade than we had before. That may be something we need to factor in. Can we actually be sure that we will be able to get supplies of the things we've actually ordered and possibly even paid for? So we maybe need to factor it in. And if we're wanting to try and reduce our risk by splitting our supply, maybe we shouldn't just go for 2 suppliers in China, but we should look at different geographies. So maybe we should have a Chinese supplier and a Middle East supplier, or a Middle East supplier and an American supplier, or a European supplier and an African supplier, so that we're not dependent on the same countries and the same supply chains within those countries. That leads me to the last thing I want to think about, which is looking at how we're going to be going forward. What is the new normal going to be like next year and after? And is this the time when we can look at risk as giving us an incentive to develop our local supply bases? Now, there are already a lot of initiatives going on here. You may have in-country value programs. I've just picked on 2. Oman, looking at the total spend retained in country, and ADNOC in Abu Dhabi having a quite explicit program based on goods that are manufactured in first of all Abu Dhabi and then the rest of the Emirates and then the Gulf. These things are useful, and they can be used to support a diversification of our supply base. There are risks and opportunities, though. There could be additional costs. One thing about China is that it's very good now at manufacturing and assembling these products. So building our own capacity to do that will take time. And there will be some people who will be doing some false values. So they will take Chinese goods and stick a badge on them and claim that they are local manufacture. We have to be aware of that and have systems that prevent it. It could also lead to wage inflation. One of the things we can look at, though, is that this will then give us products to export. Customer service may easily be improved if we're making and delivering things locally. We may be able to control and stimulate our own innovation and the production of services and products that suit our region, our customers, our country. Stock holding should be within country, so that should give us a benefit. Obviously, the legal system is going to be based on our system, and it will help the general economy, which can be very useful. So there are pros and cons, and these need to be worked through. Generally, when we're looking at local suppliers, we recommend you look at the contract size. You may need to give people starter contracts, small contracts, to allow them to get going, because they cannot take over the whole of your demand in one go. You may need to work with their technical staff to make sure they're aware of your requirements. You may need to help hold their hand and give them feedback. To stimulate their investment, you could even give them a price advantage. So as long as their price is within 5% or 10% of the international price, you'll give them a preference. These all help, but you do have to be careful to avoid laziness or becoming dependent on just one source who happens to be in your country, rather than one source who happens to be outside. And you can look at this, what blockers, what stops new suppliers, and some of them are things we don't think about. I've talked about the capacity and volume. You may want to place big orders and they can't meet them. Can you break it into smaller orders? Do you require them to have high insurance? But a really common problem is what the Americans call catch-22. You need experience to get the contract, but you can't get experience unless you have a contract. But you can't get a contract unless you have experience. And you don't have experience because you can't get a contract because you didn't have any experience because you couldn't get. How do you break out of that loop? You need to sometimes take a very, very positive attitude and say, we will give people an opportunity because in the end, it's going to be valuable for us. And again, we want them to do that for every category of supply. Strategic suppliers, that may be a bit much. Acquisition, we don't need to bother. Bottleneck, that may be a sensible approach. Leverage, we have to question whether we actually have a marketplace that will do this for us or whether we need to support it. We've got this typical supplier development process here: startup planning, relationship management, performance management, and then obtaining value. And we go through that in much more detail on the course. But we're getting to the point now where I'm afraid I've given you the highlights, the quick overview of what we want to do, and we're getting towards the end. So what are the messages that we actually want to emphasize? Well, you need to think about your procurement and your supply chain now, because we're going to go through phases. At the moment, people are still stuck very heavily in phase one. Get through this. And maybe up until the end of the year, that's it. We'll survive, contain, just get through it, do whatever we can. Sometime, and I don't know when, I've said Q3, it could be Q2, it could be Q4. We're going to start recovering and things are going to go adjusting. We're able to deliver our courses online. That's a sign of adjustment. So there's a certain amount of recovery. But then there's the new normal. What happens next year and beyond when the pandemic hopefully has been resolved and we've all restructured? As a training provider, we look, do we carry on doing face-to-face events? We'd like to think so because we think they're very useful and valuable processes. Do we carry on providing online events? Well, that's something we can be guided by our customers. But it's something that we have to think about for the future. What will training for us look like next year? What will it look like for you? What will your business look like? Key takeaways I want to do is, going back to the beginning, you need to have a strategy. That's for your whole organization, but particularly we're looking at supply chain and procurement issues. You know what you want to do. Do I want to take the risk of having a lean, efficient supply chain with low prices, but that may snap? Or do I want to be resilient, have a diverse supply chain, and know I may spend a little bit more, but I'll be able to better overcome any problems, any bumps in the road? You need good data, and then you can develop your plans on what you need to do. Now, I'll be happy to take questions from people in a minute, but just before we do, I'd like to just remind you of those dates. The first one is restarting your supply chain on 14th, 15th of June. That's a 2-day course, and it's a brand new course, so we hope it's relevant for you. The second one is Advanced Purchasing Management, which is a 2-day version of our full 5-day course, which we hope captures all of the issues. And that will be on 21st, 22nd of June. And of course, you can get full details of all of our courses at EuroMaTech.com. And that's all I need to say for me at the moment. So if we do have any questions, I will be happy to answer them in the chat. I'm not seeing any at the moment. And so in that case, I do hope that this has been useful. I hope it's been interesting. Obviously, I hope it will stimulate you to come along to some of our future training courses on procurement and supply chain, but also on some of the other topics that we are running. This webinar will be available online on our website in the near future, depending on when our team can get it up. We will be having more webinars on different topics in the future. We hope you will stay in touch. Oh, and I do have a question. Right. What is the worst effect on manpower sourcing for projects? Good question. It will depend very much on where you actually are. As I said before, we do have travel restrictions. We know many people have gone back to their home country, and you're in Nigeria. And I don't know what the situation is. First of all, many people have gone home to their home country. It is unknown when they will be allowed to come back. They may well have to go through some quarantine period before they can start working. It is possible some of them will choose not to. So we have to make a distinction between people who may have the skills that we need and who are going to be very valuable to us, like that commissioning team that I was talking about for the chemical plant. It's highly skilled, dedicated team who have irreplaceable skills. And the more general labor, maybe we can source from other places, but we could be very dependent on people coming back who may decide they don't like the risk. Their government may not let them leave the country. They may have all sorts of problems. They may not be able to get visas for some countries. What we can't do at the moment is assume that both us and our suppliers will have the manpower that they had before. Now, China is in a better situation for that because China is, generally speaking, uses mostly Chinese labor. But of course, some of those people will have gone back from the cities where they were working to their families. And the question is, will they come back? We don't honestly know. Another issue of that may be that we find that some companies will not have been able to survive this pandemic, and so their staff may have taken up other postings, and we've lost their skills, and we can't find direct replacements. So it is going to depend very much on what industry you're in, what country you're in. It's a case-by-case situation. All I can say is don't assume that things will go back to exactly the way they were before, and that you will have the volume of staff and the skilled staff that you had before. And don't assume that your suppliers will either. Okay. I should also say on that is one of the other issues is that many people are working from home when they're able to do so. As you can see, I am too. I think there will be a trend to some people wanting to do more work, not in the office, but based at home. And that's going to be very interesting because it means there may be a lot of empty office space, but it does cut down on some of those internal dynamics, that team building, that relationship, and that ease of communication. And we have to be careful of those impacts as well. It's quite useful. It helps people keep safe, it helps them produce something, but we don't quite know how it's going to work in the future. Any more? Okay, in that case, thank you very much for coming. We really do appreciate it. We really do hope to see you on our webinars and our training courses. And personally, I hope to see you all face-to-face in the very near future. But we will see. Take care of yourselves and hope to see you again soon, inshallah. And Eid Mubarak to everybody at this special time. Thank you.